No, so younger generation, perfect example, because they are mostly Green supporters and they're definitely on that side of things. But unfortunately, Adam Bandt looks to have lost his seat.
Look, it's really, really sad that the leader of Hamas in Australia is going to be unemployed shortly. I find that tragic. No, look, it is really interesting because the Greens are not who they used to be. And yes, I know that was the advanced slogan, blah, 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 but they were observing something that was true. I riffed on exactly this concept when I campaigned unsuccessfully, it must be said, in Tasmania at the previous federal election. I made overtures to disillusioned Greens voters because the Greens were a relatively young party. I think it was either the 80s or the early 90s. I can't remember which, that the federal Greens started. I think early 80s, the state Greens in Tasmania started. I think it was early 90s, the federal Greens started. They're only about 30, 35 years old. They've had a massive impact on Australian politics, far disproportionate to the amount of votes they get and the amount of sitting members that they have. But in that time, they've also morphed dramatically because as much as it might have been green issues, and particularly the Tarkine Dam and you know, the Franklin Dam and Tasmania-specific issues really gave birth to it. And by the way, they were the very first dedicated environmentalist political party in the world. So, I mean, credit to them. They were leading the way in a direction that I disagree with, but nevertheless, they were leading the way. They said, hey, someone should do something. We'll be a someone. We'll start a party that's going to represent these things. Okay, fair play to you, right? But over time, they ceased to be that Greens party. And I don't think that's entirely their fault because, of course, 1989 is when the Berlin Wall fell and 91 is when the USSR collapsed and the Australian Communist Party disbanded.
Yeah.
They pumped a bunch of money into a thing called the Search Foundation, which is now deeply infiltrated the Labor Party, etc. But it so happens that right around the time that the federal Greens Party was being launched, the Australian Communist Party was falling apart. So there's a whole bunch of homeless people. There's a reason why the Greens ended up being called the watermelons. They're green on the outside, red in the middle. Why? Because a whole bunch of communists, which is fundamentally an anti-human ideology, that's at its core, that's what it is. Humans are the problem. The more we eliminate, the better. They went looking for a new home. And you got Labor, which at the time was still a pro-worker family. Well, that doesn't fit. You got Liberal, which at the time were more of a pro-business family. That doesn't fit. You've got the Greens, which are a pro-environment. Did I say family for those? I kept saying family, didn't I? A pro-Labor and pro-business party. And then they got the Greens, and they said, well, they're pro-environment, which actually we can substitute that for anti-humanism very, very easily, very, very quickly. And so that's part of why the Greens got so much momentum so quickly is because they got a bunch of communists and now this is the fruit of that.
I think the Greens have descended into a doomsday cult. I really do. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, everything about their rhetoric is about absolute devastation, the world's ending, it's apocalyptic. And to be fair, when you're a young person, you are that impressionable. Of course, you're going to try and like sway away from what your parents do and you're going to push that and try and, you know, experiment and see things. But with the Greens, the reason they've got such a young vote is they've capitalised on that momentum that these young kids have been indoctrinated, that the climate is about to fall apart and we're all going to die and burn to death or freeze to death, whichever one you want to lean into, whichever one's currently trending. And that, you know, we're all cruel, we're slave drivers, we're oppressors.
But
so
fundamentally that humans are the problem. It is that anti-human.
Yeah, it's a doomsday cult.
Well, it's interesting. So I just did a video earlier this week on my YouTube reciting part of a speech done by Teddy Roosevelt. In 1910, he spoke in Paris, France. And a whole lot of it's not really relevant. It was sort of a lot of what he said was for that moment in time and the relations between France and the United States. But about half of the speech, I believe, is still relevant. So I edited it and I recited that half and put the video up. And one of the things that he warns against is people who are ever so passionate about saving the world, but won't lift a finger to actually fix the things in their own backyard. And we see that a lot with Greens. And this is why the hypocrisy really comes in, because they view themselves as so virtuous for wanting to save the world that they can give themselves permission to be bad, to do things they would never allow you or I to do. And so there's this real disconnect between, well, I'm allowed to be bad at an individual level because I'm so virtuous at a global level. And they become exactly what the Greens have become, this anti-human, corrupt and highly hypocritical group of people. And thankfully, I think Australian voters finally saw through them, and that's one of the real silver linings in this election.
Oh, shivers. That was me that time.
For a change. Normally it's me.
Something I found in my research, I've been focusing on how there's a split of the self. There's the digitized version of the self, and then there's the physical self. Yep. And I believe the young generation has become enamored with their digital version of themselves because they have much more control over that. So the person they represent on socials is that virtuous person who has all those incredible incredible different, have talked about the Scout sash.
Yeah.
They can put all those patches on there. They can put all the flags in their bios.
Yeah.
They can have the pronouns.
Yeah.
You cannot be more virtuous than you are on social media. The problem is in the physical world, it's a lot harder to carry that mantle. So they live in the digital world. That's where their friends are. That's where all their attention is. And what you find when you go over to, what dare I say, across the river to the north side or the dark, shadowy place, when you have a look around the physical area, it's really, really oppressive. It's sad.
So I would actually say that this is sort of a picture of Dorian Gray. You're familiar with the film or the book. A very beautiful, handsome young man gets a portrait made of himself, and through sort of black magic, so to speak, the aging and the distortion of that picture pays for him to be eternally young. But the more he sins and the more he indulges and the more he's hedonistic, the more warped and twisted that picture becomes. And I almost feel like that's what's happening with people that live so deeply in the digital world, where they can maintain the perfect. They can be forever young. They can be forever virtuous. They can jump on every single cause. That the more people indulge in that, the more twisted the real life picture actually becomes.
Well, the interesting thing about that, when you said hedonism, these are the same people that are all pro the trans stuff. They're pro the OnlyFans stuff. Sex work is real work. You should be able to have sex with whoever you want and have sex as
in
much
their
as you
defense,
want.
having sex is exhausting. I mean, that is hard work sometimes. All right.
I'm not saying it. There was a Bonnie Blue joke, but I won't. I'll refrain. But, so the hedonism is a really good example. You look at Gen Z, they're the most liberal in that sense, but they're also the most unhappy. So there's a real connect there between being able to indulge in all those vices that traditionally were frowned upon.
Yeah.
And now they're not only indulging, they're basically like rolling around in this all day, every day. And then they're getting the money from it. So they're anti-capitalism, but not when it comes to using sex works to make heaps of money on OnlyFans. That's okay. And so I think
they're so anti-capitalist that they'll sell you a T-shirt to tell the world how anti-capitalist you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was my favourite thing about the big Palestine protest when we were in UK.
Yeah.
There was a tent selling all
every
the
100
socialism
meters,
stuff.
there's another tent selling socialism and taking donations. Like, wow.
But, so back to what we were meant to be talking about, Adam Bandt losing his seat. I find it really interesting because now, as I said, I talk to a lot of people who aren't necessarily aligned with me politically, and I'm in the arts industry, so it's really hard to avoid it anyway. And now the conversation is, what's happened to the city?
Yeah.
Why is Melbourne so crap? Where are all the shops?
Yeah.
Why are there so many homeless people?
Oh,
And
you're
I'm
only
like,
noticing that now.
Well, yeah, that's the problem. It has to get to a point where, I say this every podcast, it has to be impacting that person directly. And now it's getting to the point where people are getting groped on public transport. They're smelling urine everywhere. There's homeless people everywhere. It looks like it's decaying.
It's a failure of capitalism. Don't you know that, Carly? It's a failure of capitalism.
I always joke about Melbourne being Gotham City, but it's getting there.
It's getting there, yeah.
And now it's getting to the point where you can no longer talk around it. You can't blame lockdowns anymore. That was 3.5 years ago. There's a reason the city is starting to hollow out.
They've admitted there's a crime wave.
Correct.
They've finally done that and said, we need to reform bail laws. Not that
they
they're
still
doing a very
haven't.
good job with that. It's inescapable that there is a vacancy issue with commercial and particularly retail real estate in the CBD. It is inescapable that there is a homelessness issue, and yes, that's a complicated issue, and there's often a lot of inputs into why someone ends up in that situation. But the fact is, if more people are ending up in that situation, that's not a good indicator. Net migration out of Victoria has been very, very high in terms of people who were here for a very long time. We are seeing all of the signs, and the fact that people are only just catching up now is kind of infuriating. But back to the good news, which is not only is Adam Bandt looking very likely to lose his seat, I'm not sure it's 100% yet. I think there's still some preferences to
I think it's pretty undeniable. If I pull up, I've got the ABC's federal election results. So current estimate, 69.2% of the votes being counted, updated 35 minutes ago. ALP is ahead at a 52.9% over a 47.1.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's unrecoverable.
That's a pretty convincing difference. But I believe that all 4 Greens seats are either lost or in doubt.
The only one is Ryan up north.
Are they holding that, or are they?
If I zoom out to the full national map, let's have a look. I think they were holding it. So that's in Queensland, Ryan, isn't it?
All right, well played to them if they've held one, but that is a massive reversal of direction, because the presumption was the Greens are on the march and they're going to keep rising and growing, and they're going to take over Melbourne, they're going to take over Sydney, they're going to take over Brisbane, and they're not going back after that.
Yeah, so the Ryan one at 81.4% counted updated 21 minutes ago. There's a 3.8% swing to the Greens. So the Liberal
Swing to the Greens.
Swing to
That's
the Greens.
interesting. Okay.
The Liberal National candidate Maggie Forrest at 43.5%, Elizabeth Watson-Brown at 56.5%. And
Yeah, wow. Okay.
what's to say? She's ahead by 11,000 votes.
Yeah, okay. Well, they're going to hold that for sure. That's interesting. A swing to the Greens. Now, I'm assuming that's a swing to the Greens on a two-party preferred basis. Or can you see from that quickly whether there was a Labor candidate in that seat?
Yeah, I'm sure I can. Let's have a look. Back to there.
Because that'll be interesting to see what was the primary for Labor.
More details.
Because if that swing to the Greens is actually on the back of a swing away from the Liberals towards Labor, and then the preference is flowing from Labor to the Greens,
this is what's
that
interesting.
would make sense.
So obviously Labor's preferencing the Greens above Liberals? Or not necessarily?
I can't say confidently unless I could see their how to vote card for that seat. But let's remember that voters direct their preferences. The party writes out a how to vote card and recommends a certain arrangement, but it's down to the voters to actually do it.
So Liberal National Party on 35.2% of the vote.
Yeah,
Greens.
This is primary.
Yep. Greens got 28.8%.
Yep.
Labor Party 28.1%.
So that's all that was in it. That's all that was in it. A fraction of a difference in that primary vote, and this would be coming down to the wire. This seat would be going to Labor on the back of Greens' preferences. But because the Greens outpolled Labor by less than a percentage point in the primary, Labor gets eliminated first, and most of their preferences are naturally going to flow to the Greens.
And then you've got all the minor parties
That's all it
underneath,
takes.
which are insignificant. You know, 1-2% here, there.
Now we'll come back to that when we talk about the splitting of the vote later.
Yeah. So I just find it really interesting. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I celebrated that Adam Bandt, you know, he's just insufferable. And look, the thing is, I will say this again, playing that devil's advocate part. I do think it's really important that there's a combination of different people reflected in Parliament. I think you do need someone from the Greens. I don't want to say that they shouldn't be there at all, because what it does, I believe, I think of it like a bowling alley. They're like your bumpers on the side to stop you going too far. When you got someone on the fringe, like, you know, that's what Pauline Hanson was considered 20 years ago, right? We need a couple, so just so we know we're not swaying the whole boat to the wrong side.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting comparison to make. So the Greens on the outflanking Labor on the left, and One Nation supposedly outflanking the Liberal Party on the right, doing what the Nationals originally used to do, and then the Liberal Party kind of brought them into their tent by forming a coalition with them. Now, what's interesting about both parties now is it's very clear that they've both peaked. So One Nation, I had high hopes were going to do quite well. Obviously, I wanted the Libertarians to do a lot better than they did. Let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Libertarian result was abysmal, and that's really disappointing for me. I'm in their corner. Clearly, I didn't get the message through enough to my people, and as a general rule, the party didn't get its message through to enough people. We need to learn from that. Well, here you are again. Thank you so much for watching the Oddcast. You've just seen a clip from the wonderful Carly and myself. Am I wonderful? No, but Carly is. And between us, we make a good team. So head on over to the Oddcast HQ on YouTube and watch our full episodes over there.